Now, I just want to lay out a game plan here for the next 4 episodes. We're going to do a series on creation stories in the Bible and their theological message.
Creation stories, as in more than one?
Yes, that's correct. I know a lot of people when we say creation stories in the Bible, they just assume Genesis 1. But depending on how you count them, there's upwards of 20 in the Bible.
What?
You'll see as we get into it. And we're purposely going to talk about a few of the not so familiar ones first before we get into Genesis 1. And actually even debated not even doing Genesis 1 just because it's such a well-trodden path.
Yeah, we've all heard it many times.
But hopefully, after we put these stories in their ancient literary context and look at a few others and see how they work, the Genesis 1 story hopefully will come alive for you. You can really get at its theological message, and you can see what the author was trying to intend to communicate. And you may be surprised it has very little to do with the way it's normally presented.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so what we're going to do in the first episode is we're going to talk about creation stories in general in the ancient Near East. So all of Israel's neighbors. We'll look at one from Babylon, one from Canaanite literature, and, of course, the Egyptian ones. And then we're going to talk about Psalm 104, which is a creation story in the Psalms. And then in the following episode, we'll look at a creation story that's in the book of Proverbs. And then we're going to get into Genesis 1 and 2 in the third episode. Then in the fourth episode, I'd like to talk about how the different motifs and characteristics of these creation stories are used by other biblical authors to make different theological points. So, for example, we'll see how the New Testament authors quote these stories in order to explain their theology about Christ.
Why do you think looking at Israel's neighbors' creation stories are important?
Because what we're going to find is that there is almost a ubiquitous standard of how these stories were written. It's more so that they had a common cosmology, a common worldview in the ancient Near East. So when Israel writes a creation story, or an Israelite, they're going to follow that same pattern and mention some of the same things that would have been important to an ancient person when it comes to cosmology, or how the world is put together, or the human's place in the world. And a lot of times it's actually going to be what's called a polemic. It's going to be an argument against other understandings of creation.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it then and let's take a look.
All right, let's begin. Now imagine, if you will, traveling to the land of Israel today and standing on a hill in the countryside facing west, watching the sun set over the horizon, the Mediterranean Sea off in the distance. Now imagine traveling back in time, standing on that spot, to approximately, let's say, 1800 BC. Now, of course, there would be no city lights or traffic or air pollution or any of those things. Perhaps the only sound you'd hear would be the wind and perhaps the blurting of sheep as they graze on the hillside. And let's just imagine there's a shepherd standing there with you, and you were to ask this ancient person to describe how it is that they see the world. The world that this person would then describe would be one that is a big flat disk that stands on foundations and then is surrounded by water on all sides, above and below. And the waters that are above are held back by a giant metal dome that stretches over the earth. And the sun, moon, and stars, well, those are just deities that live up in the heavens, that control the world and bring order to the universe. Now, of course, as a modern person, you might laugh at this and say that that is utterly preposterous. And suppose you were to ask this ancient person, how do you know this? Well, this ancient person would probably first of all laugh at you, and then he'd say definitively, look at it. He would point to the horizon, to the sun setting, and he'd spin around in a circle, tracing the horizon in every direction, all the way around, till he's pointing at the sun again. And he'd call that the circle of the earth. Well, what about the waters that surround the earth above and below and around? Well, it rains, doesn't it? So obviously there's water up there, and it's blue. Sky is blue. And if you dig a hole, doesn't it fill with water? And if you walk in any direction, you will eventually reach an ocean. Now, what about that bit about the stars and the sun and the moon ruling the world? Do you really think those things are alive up there? Again, he would laugh and he'd say, well, they move, don't they? Although they're not made out of flesh, they're made out of glory or fire. And they mark out the times in the seasons. When they're in such and such a position, it's time for harvest. In another position, it's time to sow. And if I don't sow or harvest on those times, my crops don't grow properly. What else would you call that but a deity? Because you see, the ancient worldview is very much empirical in the sense that it is based on what the world looks like and what it feels like to live in it. And it is this ancient worldview that's described in their mythological stories. Now, one more important element to mention when it comes to ancient Near Eastern creation stories is this concept of duality. You could say in the modern world that the fundamental duality that people think of is good versus evil. You see that in our stories. And in Christian circles, a lot of times you see this dichotomy between spiritual and physical. Now, an ancient person would have been certainly sophisticated enough to talk about these categories, but for them, the fundamental dichotomy of the universe is between chaos and order. When a thing is brought into existence, its ontology was based upon it being separated out from the chaos and named. Because in the ancient world, when you named something, you gave it a role and a function. And you see that element playing out in all of these creation stories. Now, before we begin our discussion on Psalm 104, I'd like to just quickly go through a few ancient mythological stories, just so you can get the sense of how this genre of literature worked. Now, the first one of these stories comes to us from the Mesopotamian region. It's called the Enuma Elish. Now, the first version of this story to be recovered by archaeologists was in 1849, and it was discovered in what was ancient Assyria, in the library of Ashurbanipal, and it dates from around the 7th century BC, although the story probably goes as far back as the 18th century BC. Here are the first few lines. When the skies above were not yet named, nor the earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and maker Tiamat, who bore them all. Now, right away, you see this element of things really don't exist yet because nothing's been named. There's no sky or earth. And the two characters there, Apsu and Tiamat, represent the primeval chaos waters. Apsu was fresh water, and Tiamat was salt water. Out from the mingling of these two together emerges Lahmu and Lahamu, and they begat the gods, or the first generations of gods. And then they begat the second generation of gods, one of which was the god Ea. Now, the problem with Ea and his brothers is there was no earth yet, so there's not much around. Nothing's really been created, so there's not much for them to do, so they just ran around making noise. And this bothered Apsu and Tiamat, who were trying the rest. So Apsu went out to confront them and destroy Ea. But Ea killed Apsu first. Of course, Tiamat is now enraged. So what she does is she makes an army of monsters, of dragons and demons and serpents and so on. And she makes a demon called Kingu to lead her army. And this army is going to march out and destroy all the rest of the gods. But Ea, with the help of a goddess, created the god Marduk. And Marduk was given a whole list of names. He was the sun god, the god of wisdom, and the storm god, and so on and so forth. And they made a deal with him that if he went out and fought Tiamat's army and defeated them, he would be able to rule the universe. So that's exactly what Marduk did. He destroyed Tiamat's army and then went to face Tiamat herself. Tiamat appeared as a giant dragon and opened her mouth to scream at Marduk. But Marduk took a hurricane and threw it down her throat, and while she was choking on the hurricane, whack, he cuts her in half. And from the two halves of her body, he then forms the sky, and the land. And then Marduk begins to order the universe. He sets the stars, the moon, and the sun in place, and he started assigning all the other gods responsibilities, giving them all jobs and roles to do. So the other gods kind of resented this a bit. They'd prefer just to hang out and party. So Marduk suggested that they make another race of beings to do the menial work so they can have some relief from their responsibilities. Then Ea takes the blood of Kingu, who was the leader of Tiamat's army, and along with some of the bones of the dead monsters, and the dirt, and forms humans. Thus he formed mankind, imposed toil on them, and set the gods free. So the gods ascend to heaven, leaving the humans on earth to do the menial work the other gods couldn't be bothered with. So in this story, you see depicted the struggle of chaos versus order. And also you see the role of humans being depicted as slaves for the gods. And incidentally, the kings in Mesopotamia were meant to be a representation of Marduk. So a story that says that the role of humanity is to do the menial tasks of the gods would be quite convenient for them. Now, turning to Egypt, we have a whole collection of creation stories. One of the interesting things about Egyptian creation stories is the fact that we have so many of them. I won't go through any of them in great detail, but I will point out some commonalities between them all, such as they usually have the element of the primeval chaos waters, just like the Mesopotamian story. You also have the contest between chaos and order, symbolized in the battle between Ra, the sun god, and Apophis. And you have the concept of separation of heavens and the earth, or the splitting apart of the waters, as well as the concept of things coming into existence when you name them. And you also have some other interesting features, like in some of the stories you'll have the idea of a cosmic egg that will represent the primeval waters or the earth. Now there's one interesting creation story from Memphis specifically, from around 700 BC. It involves the god Ptah, who is the god of wisdom and craftsmen. And he creates the universe by speaking and naming things, just by calling things into existence. This is more of an intellectual creation of the world instead of a battle between gods and monsters. And there is some evidence that this story goes as far back as 3000 BC. Now moving on to a mythological story that is one that was discovered in the ancient ruins of the city of Ugarit. Now, the ancient literature that was discovered at the city of Ugarit is most relevant to biblical studies because it gives us a window or a glimpse into the mythological stories of the Canaanites. And if you're familiar at all with the history contained in the Old Testament, the Israelites would often turn to other gods, and they were usually Baal or Ashtaroth. Now, these are the gods of the Canaanites, and they're the gods from these stories. And one story in particular that we're going to look at is called the Baal and Anat cycle. Now, I'll just give you the cliff notes of the story here. There is El, who is the supreme creator god, and then there's Baal, who is the storm god or the god of fertility. Baal ascends to become king over all the other gods. And as the story goes, there is Ya'am, who's the god of the sea, and he has a servant named Lotan, or in Hebrew, it's Leviathan, and he wants to rule over the other gods. So Baal and Yam have a fight, and Baal wins and slays both Leviathan and Yam, and Baal and the other gods persuade El to let him build a palace in which he can then rule the world from the top of Mount Zaphon. And then there is Mot, who is the god of death, and he's described as this giant consuming monster whose top lip touches the heavens and bottom lip touches the earth, and his mouth is a gateway to the underworld. And he challenged Baal, and Baal loses. Baal is swallowed up and goes down to the underworld. Then Anet brutally kills Mot, and then eventually Baal returns from the underworld, and Mot recovers from his battle with Anet, but Mot decides not to challenge Baal anymore and submits to his rule. Now I'd like to just take a moment and look at some of the common motifs or elements that we're seeing across these mythological stories. So when we start dealing with the biblical text, we'll be able to recognize these elements when they show up. Now, first there is the chaos conf, this idea of order versus chaos. In the Mesopotamian story, it was Marduk versus Tiamat. In the Baal cycle, it was Baal versus Yam and Leviathan. In Hebrew, the idea of chaos is represented by words like Tananim and Tahom, and also Leviathan or Yom. These words are usually translated the deep or sea. And then there's also this element of separation, whether it be of the waters or heaven and earth, that we see throughout these stories. And along with it, we saw the motif of naming, or assigning of functions to different things in the created order. And then there's the element of wisdom that we see in all of these stories, whether represented by Marduk in the Mesopotamian stories or in the Baal cycle. It is the god of wisdom that helps Baal build his temple on Mount Zaphon. Which brings us to the next element, which is this idea of temple building, or the building of a palace or divine headquarters, usually on a mountaintop or a garden or a capital city. Like in the Mesopotamian story, it is Babylon. In the Baal cycle, it's Mount Zaphon. In the Egyptian stories, of course, it's whatever capital they're trying to promote at the time, whether it's Memphis or Thebes or any of the others. And another important element is the idea of a divine assembly or divine council, where the major deity sits at the head of the council and the other gods are there as his advisors and there to help him administrate the created order. Now, we looked at different creation stories from around the ancient Near East. Now we're going to turn to the ones that are in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And the one we're going to look at now is Psalm 104. And as we go through, you'll see these different elements show up throughout the text. Psalm 104, starting in verse 1. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. Yahweh is my God. He is very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers spirits, his ministers a blazing fire. Now, right off in verse 1, we see, Bless Yahweh, O my soul, where there is nephesh. And it has to do with the very being or essence of a person. So, bless Yahweh with my existence. It's a declaration of loyalty to Yahweh. And then the next line, Yahweh Elohai, Yahweh is my El. Yes, in these first few verses, you definitely see parallels to the Baal cycle from Ugarit, where in that story you had El, the supreme god, and then Baal, the storm god or god of fertility. You see this motif actually in mythologies from all over the world. You see it in Norse mythology between like Odin and Thor, and also in Greek mythology between Kronos and Zeus. And there's plenty of other examples. But it's interesting here in Psalm 104, the author starts off with saying, Yahweh is my El. But yet in verse 3, he describes him as making the clouds his chariot and riding on the wings of the wind. That is right out of the Baal cycle. That is an epitaph for Baal. He was known as the cloud rider. So what the psalmist is communicating, that would have been aware of that story, that his God, his El, is Yahweh, and he fills both of those categories, those concepts of God, the high supreme God, creator, and the storm god who is manifest in the world. So he's saying, my God is both El and the storm god. So Yahweh fills both of those slots for him. He's a monotheist. We also see the motif of temple building here, where in verse 3 he talks about the beams of his chambers are on the waters. So he's setting up his temple, his celestial headquarters above all of the creation. Then in verse 4, you have the establishment of the divine council idea. In the first line, his messengers as spirits or winds, that's Melekai Ruach Ot, which could also be translated as angels as spirits. And the second line is ministers of blazing fire. That's just another word for stars, which the ancient people would have thought of as divine beings. So in just these first few verses, The psalmist establishes himself as a monotheist, and it's Yahweh who is the creator God and the storm god, and his temple or his headquarters is above all of creation, and all the other celestial divine beings, they're a part of his council. They work for him. See, right off in these first few verses, he sets up this contrast by using the commonly accepted motifs of creation mythology. He draws a very strong distinction between Yahweh and any other gods from the ancient Near East. Continuing on, verse 5, he sets the earth on its foundations so that it can never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. And in verse 6, it's interesting to note, they covered it with the deep as with a garment. The word there is tahom. It's one of those words that's associated with the primeval waters of chaos. And instead of there being this battle between Yahweh and a giant sea monster, like in the other mythologies, you have Yahweh just speaks, and the chaos waters just obey, and they separate, and the earth is formed. Now, continuing on in verse 10, he makes springs gush forth in the valleys, and they flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkey quenches their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. Again, you see Yahweh filling this role as the storm god, the one who brings fertility and supplies the earth. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for the humans to cultivate, that they may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart, and oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the human heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests, and the stork finds her home in the fir trees. High mountains are for the wild goats, and rocks a refuge for the rock badgers. And this mention of the cedars of Lebanon is interesting, because in the ancient Near East they were often considered sacred. And when one was building a temple, they would often travel to Lebanon, or they'd often buy cedar trees from Lebanon to build their temples. Continuing on in verse 19, you made the moon to mark out the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep about. Young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from El. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Adam goes out to his work, and to his labor until evening. This section is interesting because the words there for the moon and the sun are actually deity names from the ancient Near East. Yarach for the moon and Shemesh for the sun. And you can see that they have their roles in marking out times and seasons. They're bringing order to the cosmos. They're working as God's agents within it. And this is significant because Adam, or humanity, in verse 23, is mentioned right along with him. This is in contrast to the Mesopotamian story where humans were made to be the slaves of the gods, to do menial labor. But here, humanity is put right alongside the sun and the moon as having a purpose within the created order. And continuing on in verse 24, Yahweh, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea. Or in Hebrew here is Yam. Same word for the chaos deity from the Baal cycle. So here is Hayam, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships, and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. Or literally in Hebrew, you formed to play with him. Which is interesting because, like I said before, you don't have this great battle between the storm god and Yam here. Yam is just the sea, and Leviathan is just a creature in it. So this great, dreadful manifestation of chaos and terror, these giant monsters are reduced to just the sea, and Leviathan is reduced almost in status to a goldfish in a bowl almost. You can actually call this a demytholization of the Baal cycle in that sense. And continuing on in verse 27, these all look to you to give them their food in due season, and you give it to them. They gather it up, and when you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. And when you take away your breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Continuing on, verse 31. May the glory of Yahweh endure forever. May Yahweh rejoice in his works. Who looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to Yahweh as long as I live. I will praise my El while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him. For I rejoice in Yahweh. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. A little interesting text note here. That last phrase, praise the Lord, is the word hallelujah in Hebrew. And if you look at the surrounding Psalms, Psalm 103, 105, and 106, you can see that praise the Lord or that hallelujah probably actually belongs into Psalm 105, which then would make Psalm 105 and 106 both begin and end with a hallelujah, and Psalm 103 and 104 both begin and end with bless Yahweh, O my soul. Now, looking at this psalm as a whole, you can see the parallels between it and the Baal cycle and the different theological points that the author is making. And the whole thing is really just a declaration of loyalty to Yahweh. And the reasons for that he lays out is that Yahweh is both the high god El and the storm god that is within the cosmos and sustains it and brings life. He's not just some distant creator, or to say it in theological terms, he is both transcendent and immanent.
Well, all right then. That's a lot to take in. So we've taken a look at a few different stories from ancient cultures. So was all these, the Ugaritic story and the Egyptian story, would it be common knowledge among the Israelites during this day?
Possibly. The Ugaritic one, definitely, because the stories of Baal and Asherah, you see them or all throughout the Old Testament. And in fact, the Baal cycle that we talked about, you can make a good argument that that one's actually quoted quite a bit in the Old Testament. Because when the Israelites would often turn away from Yahweh and turn to other gods, and the prophets would have to, rise up and point out their apostasy, the gods that they were turning to were usually Baal or Ashtoreth. Like if you read the story about Ahab and Jezebel, Jezebel was from the city of Tyre, which is on the coast of Syria up by Ugarit, and she promoted very much the Baal cult in Israel. So the whole story between Elijah and the prophets of Baal.
All right.
That's where that comes in.
So who do you think was the writer of Psalm 104?
We do not know. They didn't really think of, like we think of copyright, so they didn't really put their names on them. And it's difficult to date because Hebrew poetry, when they would write it, they would make it sound archaic on purpose. It's almost like someone today writing a poem and using archaic words or trying to sound like Shakespeare. But the consistency with the Baal cycle that we found in 104, mentions of the same motifs and even the same names for the gods that are mentioned there, suggests that either the author was very familiar with the Baal cycle, so it may be that they're all drawing from even older stories that they all have in common.
So if all these stories have so much in common, isn't that basically plagiarism?
No, because they all make their own point. Like if you were to write a story today and start off with once upon a time, are you plagiarizing that? Or is that just the way stories start? Think of the motifs in our stories, like the hero myth. You have a hero who runs into adversity and he goes on a quest and defeats the evil empire. Would you say all these stories are copying from each other, or are they all just drawing from the same literary well? And in the case of mythological stories, they're very archetypical in the Jungian sense. So these are symbols that have deep, deep meaning, even if you don't even realize it.
So what are the common symbols throughout all these stories?
Well, it's like some of the ones that we mentioned. There's the idea of the chaos comp, order versus chaos. That theme is pretty huge. It's almost in all of them in slightly different ways.
And that's represented as like water.
Yes, chaos is usually the deep, or Tehom, or Leviathan, or a great sea monster, or Tiamat in the Babylonian stories. And as we saw in Psalm 104, the psalmist is taking the motifs of Yam, the sea, and Leviathan, the great sea monster, using them, but to make his own point. Because he's showing the sea is just water. It's subdued. It's nothing to be afraid of. God is not intimidated. He doesn't have to battle the sea to create the world. He just commands, and Tehom, or the deep, just spreads open, and the earth rises up out of it. There's no battle there. So the theological message that the psalmist in 104 is using is that God is in complete control. Do you see the message there? How where in, say, the Ugaritic myth, where Baal battles Yam, and there's this great fight, chaos versus order. It's a contest, and Baal wins. And same with the Babylonian story, where Marduk fights Tiamat. But here in Psalm 104, it's no, God is, and he just commands. So he's using the same symbols, but he has his own message.
So wouldn't the people of the day just see this as, hey, my God's bigger than your God?
Exactly. And that's kind of his point. You see how he starts off, Yahweh is my El, and he's also the rider on the clouds. So an ancient person reading that would have known exactly what that was. It's that kind of framework, is that there's this older creator God who's above the whole universe, and then there's the storm god, which is Baal in the Ugaritic myth. But here, Yahweh fills both of those roles. See how he's taking the mythological framework and saying, no, it's Yahweh all the way.
How did the readers of the day respond to Psalm 104, do you think?
Well, I'm assuming here, but I'm pretty sure any literate person who would have been reading through this psalm or hearing it read would have got that message right off, that Yahweh is the top God. He's the El. And he's also the storm god, the one who provides the rain that makes the crops grow. And he's the one that brings fertility and life to the world. It's not Baal. It's not El in the Ugaritic sense. And what the psalmist is doing is declaring his loyalty to Yahweh. So you see, when you put this in its literary context, how that point jumps out, and you don't get stuck on some other detail that's just common throughout all these stories.
Yeah, I get it. So is it still monotheism if there's a God above other gods?
Yes. As you can see, the psalmist's point is that Yahweh fits both of those two common slots of top god and storm god.
Yeah.
But yet there's other gods. We talked about the stars, the sun and the moon, how they would have thought of those other gods. And in the Old Testament, there's this concept called the divine council. It's one of those things that once you're aware of, you see it everywhere in the Bible. And it's this idea that God has an entourage. He sits at the head of a council when he makes his decisions. And you see this all throughout the Bible. Like Psalm 82 is a very clear example where God comes into the assemblies of the gods, and he kind of rebukes them for not doing their jobs. And you see it depicted in Job, where the sons of God have a big meeting, and thus Satan shows up.
So was this completely unique in the ancient Near East?
The revelation of monotheism is unique to them, yes.
What does that mean?
When you talk about Israelite theology, you basically have the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. The word there is echad, which can mean one, singular, or it could mean unique, as in the sense that there is none beside him. But you see how they're expressing their monotheism. They're not ditching the whole framework or their whole worldview. They're saying, no, it's Yahweh. So it's as if you believe God is revealing himself through Scripture and to these ancient people, what you have is God saying, I'm like that concept you have of gods, only I am the one. Do you see what he's doing?
Oh, I get it.
He's using their idea of what gods are and saying, I'm kind of like one of those, only I'm way above all that. And actually, I'm like a lot of them.
I can see how that could get confusing.
Yeah, because he also uses other metaphors. He says, well, I'm like a father. But of course, you have to think of what an ancient Near Eastern father would have been like to get the picture. Or I'm like a king. He uses all these metaphors. But here in these creation myths, he's saying, I'm like one of your gods, only I am the one. And the point that comes out in Psalm 104 is that, like I said, God is being revealed as transcendent, which means above and beyond all of the creation. So you can't conceive of him with any words or symbols or images or anything. But he's also immanent, meaning he's in it, sustaining it, and providing for it, and continuing it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Another point I should probably bring up here is this this atemporal aspect to these stories.
What do you mean by that?
It means that they're not stories in the sense like we think of them as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're not linear in time like that. What's being described is not a point in time. What's really being communicated is a state of affairs, the way the world is. Chaos versus order. And God is ordering. So when he creates, he starts off ordering, and then, say, the sun and the moon kind of take over ordering night and day. The stars take over their jobs, ordering whatever their job is, and the humans on Earth take over and continue ordering on Earth. So it's not an event that happens once God creates the universe. No, he begins separating and ordering, and that process involves delegating authority to these other beings. And what the psalmist does here, instead of saying humans are slaves, like in the Babylonian story, he says, no, you are just like the sun, moon, and stars. You have a responsibility within creation to continue that ordering. So the creation event is something that's happening now. There's no time to it. It's not a specific point in time in ancient history when there was nothing and God said, all right, now we're going to start. Okay, then he builds it, and then he just kind of lets it go.
What you're saying about God calling himself the Father, that's definitely nicer than the other stories where you had a master and your job was to work the world.
Yeah, like in the Babylonian story where the humans were created just for the menial tasks, because the gods, the role that was assigned to the gods by Marduk, they didn't like it. They're like, I don't want to take care of sheep and goats and grow crops. So they're like, why don't we make these humans to do that, and we can go, off to our heavenly dwelling and party.
And then you have the Israelite story.
Yeah, where it's like, no, you are co-creators. You have a specific realm and responsibility. So there's a purpose, a weight of purpose that's given to the human race in these stories. And you see it across all of the Israelite stories. And when you put it in its ancient context, you realize how much of a contrast that is from the other stories.
So would you say that's like the main point?
It's one of the main points. It's definitely one that any ancient person, Israelite or otherwise, reading these stories would see, wow, that's really different from the way these stories normally go. Humans almost on the same level as sun, moon, and stars, having a responsibility in the created order. That's huge. And it's from that the entire actually Judeo-Christian worldview and ethic is built. And when we get to Genesis 1, you'll see the concept is referred to as being made in the image of God.
Well, I'm already starting to think of Genesis 1 in a whole new way.
One more point I want to raise. There's a little prayer at the end in verse 35, last verse. Let sinners be consumed from the earth and the wicked be no more. So what this indirectly implies is that it is possible for at least humans to say, no, I don't want that responsibility of bringing order in doing work. I want to take from others. I want to lie, cheat, and steal and not carry the weight of that purpose and responsibility. So there is choice in this, in contrast to the psalmist's choice who says, no, I'm going to be loyal to the creator of this marvelous universe. In so doing, fulfill my human task of taking on that responsibility for his own being, or his nephesh, his soul. Because he begins and ends with, bless the Lord, bless Yahweh, O my soul. So it suggests that there is a choice involved here. And we'll see that come out as well in some of these other stories. All right, Paul, is there anything else you think would be good? Or do you think there's any way that we can take this theological message and express it in contemporary terms, not in an ancient Near Eastern creation story, but in a modern way?
Well, we have no shortage of ways to tell stories nowadays. We've got, music, movies, plays, video games.
Yeah.
Anything with a narrative to it, you can really get a message across.
Yeah, so you can imagine someone making a movie or writing a story that expresses this idea of human responsibility in the world and God actually giving humans responsibility. Hey, you have a job to do. There's a purpose. Just by the very nature of you being human, you have a purpose.
All right, so that was very interesting talk. I'm looking forward to what we're talking about next.
In the next episode, we're actually going to do one of my favorite creation stories from Proverbs 8. So stay tuned for that. Now, to wrap up this episode, we saw that by putting Psalm 104 into its ancient historical and literary context, that what emerges is that the author's message was that his God is transcendent, meaning he's the creator and outside of the cosmos, and he is immanent. He is within the cosmos and sustaining it, and is the one that brings life to it. And we also see that he is communicating this concept of the human role within the cosmos is to continue God's ordering of it, along with the sun, moon, and stars. So humans have a purpose, a vocation within the cosmos. And we also see communicated a little bit of a lament towards the end of the psalm that not everyone takes on the responsibility of that vocation and plays the human role of being God's agents within the cosmos. Now, as you've probably gathered, my method of interpreting the biblical literature is to try to understand it within its original context. So the question I have for you is a hermeneutical one, and hermeneutics is just a fancy word for the study of interpretation. Now, let's just say you are one who believes the Bible is the divine revelation, and you take its message seriously. How do you get at the message that is being communicated through this ancient literature without getting it confused with the ancient way that it is communicated? Or maybe you think we shouldn't, and you think the ancient worldview is what is being communicated, and that Christians today should all be wearing turbans and sandals and thinking the world is flat. This is a very important question if you want to take the Bible seriously. Let me ask it in a more succinct way. So here's the question for your contemplation. As we approach the Bible and endeavor to discover its message, how do we avoid the confusion that comes from entangling the message the biblical author is trying to communicate with the ancient culture and ways of looking at the world that this literature comes to us from?